I think last time I used Zoom. Oh, never mind. Okay, I am Curtis Wright. I am a Canadian. I grew up in Canada, and I'm going to talk about the history of Canada up until when the Dominion of Canada was established officially, which is what we call Canada. So for about 13,000 years, the Indigenous groups lived here in Canada, and they lived off of the land. They were very nomadic, very peaceful people, and they only took what they needed from the land. And then it was about 1000 AD that the Vikings were the original European settlers here, and they settled in our most eastern province called Newfoundland. It was very short-lived there. And then it was in 1497 that Giovanni Capoto was an Italian explorer, and he came here to Canada as well, but things didn't really take off until 1534. And that was the year that the then King of France, the aptly named King Francis I, sent Jacques Cartier to find a northwestern passage to India so that they could trade specifically on the water, exclusively by routes of water, and avoid the land travel. When Jacques Cartier arrived, he believed that he had arrived in India and achieved his goal. And so he called our indigenous groups Indians, which we'll hear a little bit later coming up. And he settled along what is now called the St. Lawrence area. It's in Quebec and Nova Scotia along the St. Lawrence River. And he named the area Canada from a Iroquois word called Kanata, that means village or settlement. And for a long time, they really failed to settle the area because of the unknown and unfamiliar conditions, such as weather, precipitation patterns, and soil types, as well as disease. So all of that led to starvation and illness. But eventually, with the aid of the local indigenous groups, teaching the newcomers how to harvest the land, how to catch and trap animals, how to make medicines to fight the disease, they were able to establish two settlements, one called Quebec, Ville de Quebec, or Quebec City, and the other Port Royal, which is Royal Port. In this period, beaver pelts were very highly sought after in Europe by milliners and those that made winter clothing. And because of the popularity, Europe had almost hunted to extinction European beavers. And so the Canadian pelts became quite lucrative, and this formed the beginning of the French beaver trade or fur trade here in Canada. And the French made trade agreements with indigenous groups, and they created these multi-established trading routes. So the indigenous used their many generations of experience of catching the furs, and they traded those with the Europeans for metal tools, for other commodities, for weapons. And then it was in 1608 that Samuel du Chapelain formed intercultural relationships with the Algonquin, the Montagnais, and the Huron people to fight against the Iroquois. And this alliance really garnered a lot of trust between these three indigenous groups and the French, and that really fortified their trading relationships. And in 1670, the British had taken notice of this highly lucrative fur trade in Canada and had been expanding its presence in the area. And it formed a company called the Hudsons Bay Company. And the HBC, or the Hudsons Bay Company, is still around now. It's a department store. It's been around for 352 years. And it's very similar to what you have Sears. We used to have Sears, but we don't have it anymore. So very similar kind of department store, Liverpool Sears. And because of the Hudson Bay Company and the French overhunting in the local region, supplies for the beaver pelts became quite limited. And this forced a lot of movement in the West to expand and to look for more beavers. And new trade routes and forts were established along the rivers in this undiscovered region. The main participants of the westward trade here and travel were called the Voyagers, or in English, Voyagers. And they engaged in transporting the furs by canoes. And so they would paddle, obviously, along the water. And then when they got to land, they would do something called portaging, which is when they carry the canoes over their heads with these packs of supplies that would weigh up to 41 kilos on their body. Kilos are kilograms. And obviously very grueling work, but they are celebrated as the heroes of the fur trade in the folklore and in very many songs, mostly in French, because these people were mainly French Canadians. And then moving on to the early 1700s, the French had more territory, but they began to be outnumbered by the British 10-1. And in this period, there was a war called the 7 Years' War, also known as the French Indian War of 1754 to 1763. And as you can hear, it's called the French Indian War, even though the country of India was not involved at all, because they believed that they had arrived in India originally, and Jacques Cartier named them Indians. So during this period, many of the French were deported out of Canada, and they ended up settling and establishing Louisiana, which is why there are so many wonderful French cultural pieces in that area in New Orleans and Louisiana and the Cajun region. And during this time as well, both Britain and France sent over many of their military forces to join the local militia groups and indigenous groups here in this war. And eventually the British outnumbered the French so strongly that they were able to take over their two most significant establishments, Quebec and Montreal at the time. And the end of the war was declared, and the treaty involved France conceding Canada to Britain. And at that time, we became only a British colony. At the time, there were 13 American British colonies in the US, and those who were loyal to the Brits, they returned to Canada. So in the following war of 1812, the American and Canadian militaries were unable to successfully invade each other. And that really established the border between Canada and the United States in the east as it is right now. And although Canadians were disinterested in joining the Americans, they were really desiring to have the autonomy to self-rule. And this led to the rebellions in 1837 and 1838. And then we had a very short-lived time where we were called the Republic of Canada. So although these were short-lived rebellions, the British government did end up conceding and making some concessions because, pardon me, of the support of the Canadians and the Americans. And Canada ended up being in 1840, there was upper and lower, and they were combined all into the province of Canada. And they were in that year first able to represent themselves with elected officials. And then by 1846 in the West, the disputed land were settled peacefully, and Canada became to have the geography that it has today. And throughout the 19th century, there was a big boom in logging and the farming of trees, which saw a massive wave of immigration. And this is when logging became a more lucrative industry in Canada than the fur trade. And through this, it was in 1867 that the British North American Act was established, and Canada became an official democracy and settled the capital. The capital is now in Ottawa, but prior to this period, the capital was moving around every time that there was an election period, as not to either frustrate the French or the English, or to give them the idea that one was more powerful than the other. And the capital would move between Kingston, Montreal, Toronto, Ville de Quebec, or Quebec City, and then where it settled finally in Ottawa. And this, as I said, is 1867, when we became the Dominion of Canada. And that's the end of the story. Now I think we go to questions, if there are any, or I don't know what happens next.
That was fast.
Was it fast? Did I speak fast?
Yeah.
Oh.
For me, so fast, but